Alessio. So we won't be opening for questions right now because we have the round table and many, maybe some of them will be inside of the questions we'll be making, but we will leave some time after this and every round table for people to ask questions. Okay. So within this context that Alessio just introduced, we see that new ways of pursuing an economic growth that goes hand in hand with sustainability are needed. McKinsey, for example, estimates that $275 trillion are required in the next 30 years to finance the transition towards sustainability. We have different models of doing this around the table. So we have Marta. Marta has been over 20 years in the financial sector since October 2019. She holds her current position as Director of Responsible Banking in Banco Santander, in charge of defining and implementing Santander Spain's responsible banking agenda with all its stakeholders and with a special focus on developing sustainable and responsible business with customers. And we have, well, Alessio, you already know, and we have Marion Schuppe. Marion is the investment director of Sense Invest, now co-director in Make Sense Seed 1. After starting her M&A career in Madrid, Marion is French. She has worked for 5 years at Guadia, a Swiss impact investing fund that invests in companies contributing to a regenerative economy in Europe and the USA. She has known Make Sense for a long time, even though she just joined, for more than 10 years as a citizen and participated in the board of the association for over 5 years. So my first question starts with the reflection that we've seen a transition over the last years from the focus on reducing impact, then towards sustainability, and now we're even seeing regenerative businesses, right? So not just reducing impact, but actually creating a positive impact. And we see companies like Ecosia or Patagonia changing their structures to include the planet as a stakeholder. I would like to start listening to your perspective on what does a successful transformation towards sustainability look in the economy we have today. And I'll leave it up to you who wants to start with this one.
Go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. You mentioned before that we are in this process. We have to be humble. I'm humble about after having listened to your presentation. So congratulations on that. What's success in that transition? Well, the transition has taken place. You've mentioned it. You've mentioned it as well. We've evolved from stakeholder capitalism from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. We've seen that in the bank from the traditional social responsible to and strategy where actually, apart from the financial components, the social ones and the environmental ones are included actually in the core of our pure business. That's what it takes, and that's what it is. So yes, effectively that transition has taken place. I would say that for me, in order to be successful, or what success would mean is for that transition and that evolution taking place in all the companies, in all the segments. And that's very obvious, but I would say that it's a change of paradigm. It's a shift from the focus on long-term value creation, where you integrate both the economic part and also the social and the environmental part, and that addresses the needs of the different stakeholders. You mentioned how some companies are taking that step and putting probably some stakeholders, such as the environment, at the front of their priorities. I think that's very brave, and that's where it should move to. So success for me would be for smaller companies. We are in a country here in Spain where 99% of the companies are SMEs, where 60% of the value added and 70% of the employment comes from SMEs. So we understand the importance there. And I'm going to talk a bit, not a bit, but just one word about big corporates that I probably represent. But without the SMEs on the pure businesses, entrepreneurs, they're self-employed, there's no way we can traction and we can make that happen. So to me, success is positive impact integrated in the core business of smaller companies. And just one note on the bigger companies, our responsibility is even higher. So by saying that the impact should, the positive success would be for positive impact included in smaller companies all across the value chain. That doesn't mean that we big corporates have as a responsibility. Ours is even higher, and in the case of banks, even more, because we have the ability to make decisions and to allocate fundings and capital based on not only economic factors, but also social and environmental ones. So our challenge is even bigger because we can traction somehow and increase the speed. And you mentioned at the beginning McKinsey figures. Regardless the figure about what is the investment needed for this transition, what's the investment needed in the 2030 agenda, regardless the figure, we are positive and we know is that we need private funds and public funds. So we need funding.
I don't know if you listen to me well. I would add to what Marta just said, an element of timing. I think if the transition is made within 30 years, it's good, but it's not successful. On my opinion, it needs to be fast because we don't have a lot of time to make it work. So I think this timing element is key. And in addition of the need to have on board all the stakeholders, and I fully agree with you, we need governance, we need citizens, we need also, I think, non-profit organizations, charities, and as well as businesses to be on board. And we need to make sure we don't let anybody behind. And that's also included in the donut economy, because the goal is to achieve or to give to everyone the basics everybody needs within the limits of the planet. So I think that's the social element component is key in a successful transition. And I would say also, I think small companies are much more agile today to make changes, to lead the way. But until big corporates like having a huge impact on the economy and society is cancelling in a way the positive impact created by smaller companies or more innovative in a sense of impactful companies are doing, it's not successful. Like if we keep if big corporates keep having such a negative impact that the positive impacts many of us are doing, it won't work. So I think it's great if small companies are doing good stuff and leading the way, but until big corporates are not following and doing it, making positive impact, it won't work. It won't be successful, at least.
So maybe just one word on this topic, which refers to the theory of change, let's say, that I have in mind when I talk about this transformation. The first is you were saying, it's a lot of money, McKinsey figures, and so on. So to my mind, and when you look at Europe only, we're talking only for mitigation, it's something in the ballpark of 300, 350 billion every year between now and 2030. Now, that is a huge amount of money. If to look at it, let's say, from the EU perspective, it's like the recovery plan, so this big thing that we put in place after COVID, it's as if we had to implement a new one every 2 years. So it sounds humongous, and that was, it made the headlines, the big spending, and so on. So if you look at it from a government perspective, it looks huge and impossible to achieve. If you look at it with respect to the size of the economy, so when you look at these figures with respect to the size of the economy, you're talking something in the order of 1 or 2% of GDP, which is not huge. So what we're saying is, of course, you need to unlock that investment. It doesn't happen magically, but it is not something outside of anything reasonable. So that is one thing that I think is important to underline, and that's why the role of the private sector and getting the private sector on board is so important. There's a lot that governments can and should and are doing, but only up to a certain point. The heavy lifting is left to you. And you. Smaller. So that's one point. The second point refers to why you're doing this. You were mentioning the long-term view and so on. To my mind, for a long time, we have gone around saying, that there are moral arguments as to why we're doing this. Whether it is because we're leaving the planet to our future generations, whether it is because the Industrial Revolution started here and therefore we have a responsibility for it, and so on. These are fair arguments. That's fair game, fine. But to my mind, even if you put that aside for a second, what I try to argue is we are at the cusp of something that resembles an industrial revolution. And if you believe that, you want to be at the frontier of this. If I mention the names Benz, Daimler, Maybach, Porsche to you, you know what these are. And the reason why you know what these are is that these were engineers that were experimenting with the internal combustion engine over 100 years ago. And they managed to perfect some part of the internal combustion engine, making vehicles at the time viable. And then they created their companies, and their companies' names echo a century later. Which means if you are at the frontier of these things and you manage to crack some of these crucial innovations early stage, you're locking in an advantage that might last for decades to come. And so it really makes a self-interested commercial interest, or it's smart investment, to try and be at the frontier of this green transition. And so even if you're doing it just for the money, go for it because it makes sense.
Okay, thank you. I think all of the topics that you mentioned right now, we're going to be covering in different questions. But going back to that, Alessio, you were saying right now that we, even if it's for the money, we should get into this. But should we right now focus, maybe expect less profitability in the short term to achieve that social impact and sustainability and environmental impact? Because I guess those advances are going to be seen and that profitability a lot in the long term, but not right now, right? So I'm going to, first my question is, should we expect less profitability, at least at the moment, in exchange for sustainability? And I'm going to introduce some nuances for for each one of you in the question here, right? So, Alessio, my question to you first is in how we track this. So, right now you mentioned GDP, and this is kind of one of the main metrics we have for success in different countries. Is this metric going to evolve? Are we going to start tracking different metrics in terms of success? And more we're seeing that you have to report, for example, your carbon emissions, but we've become very skeptic on how countries are actually reporting this and if this is actually done well. How do you see this?
So this is one of the topics I work on, so this agenda of saying, okay, for a long time we've been measuring success at a country level, let's say, through this metric, GDP, which has its flaws and especially has some blind angles on things that we care about, notably the environment, but also inequality, the digital dimension, which is becoming more and more relevant now. So there is a variety of problems that this metric has. The problem, and let's say we're working to improve the very way in which GDP is measured, including elements of natural capital in it, including some dimensions of better capturing the digital economy and so on. So on the one side, we're trying to improve the metric. And with we, I don't mean me and my colleagues. also Eurostat in Europe, but it is statistical agencies across the planet, because these things get done in a standardized way under the framework of the UN, and so it is statisticians from across the world that come together and try to redefine the way that we measure the very size of the economy. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is to say, this gives us a sense of how large the economy is, but that's not the end of the story. You also want to know how these extra resources that you've made available through a growth process are used. It might be, as we have discovered throughout the pandemic, that our hospitals were understaffed. It might be that our educational system is under-resourced. It might be a variety of things that suggest we're not using well the resources that we have. And that's why I think, and I argue extensively, that we should complement with a variety of indicators of the things we care about, GDP, so that you get a sense of the size of the economy, but also you get, let's say, red flashing lights in the moment in which some dimensions are underfunded, or, for example, on inequality as well. So if the economy is expanding, but it is going, as I was saying, in the hands of few rather than many, you could measure that, ideally in parallel with GDP. So you get an immediate sense of the economy expanded, but not in a fair way, let's say, or in an equal way. So we might need some policy measures to address that.
Marta, moving on to you, we've seen that corporate and big institutions and banks play a huge role, especially in your case in the sense of how we allocate those funds. And my question to you is, the other day, for example, we were presenting in Banco Santander as an inspiration to your employees, being a company that with purpose that received your financing, right? How do these companies that have a purpose differ to other businesses that ask for finance in the way they do business with you, in the way you measure their impact and the result you had? And do they get any advantages on the product they get from Banco Santander? How do you foster the relationship with this kind of startups, businesses?
Thank you. I would go to that. I would come to the initial question at the beginning just to introduce my answer. So if the question was somehow whether we have to choose between profitability and sustainability, and whether us as financier that allocate our funds based on the risk analysis and the financial performance of the company do it in a different way. So I don't think there's an alternative. I think that for us banks, the traditional sort of decisions based on risk and financing indicators has changed, and we should have to include the sustainability and some additional indicators. Some of them were the ones that you are mentioning. I don't think there's another way. It's a process, but I don't think there's another way. We in the banks are actually starting to measure climate risk, climate in terms of physical risk and transition risk. That means that the companies and those companies that do not transition are exposed to higher risk, and therefore the investors' appetite to allocate funds to those companies would decrease because they are more exposed to such risk in their physical setting, but also in the exposed to transition risk. Being transition risk, the risk attributed to regulation, to change in the consumer mindsets, to change in the economy, and so on. So we have to integrate those components. As of today, what we are seeing, it's true that we are not seeing radical better performance. We have ESG funds and social responsible funds where we've seen in the past that the performance has been much better than in the others. It's true that it has reversed somehow through this energy crisis. So we can infer somehow a better credit performance in those companies. What we are seeing now is that companies that integrate sustainability in the core of their strategy have different factors. Differentiative factors versus competitors. They get more loyal customers. They get somehow disregarding the social and economic commitments has an impact, a long-term impact in benefits. We've seen big manager funds saying that the purpose it's an growth for engine in the long run. So there's no alternative. If the question is whether in the short term we are given different conditions, we are incentivizing green decisions in terms of cars, in terms of homes, in terms of retrofittings, for individuals, for corporates, we are incentivizing those companies that want financing and they want to commit to certain KPIs to improve their own sustainability strategy and their own transition path. And if those KPIs that are included in the financing are met, the price of the finance gets reduced. It's a sustainability-linked loan that we all know. So that's the kind of thing that you're doing. And we have a commitment in terms of net zero. We have started publishing decarbonization strategies with actual committed reductions in terms of emissions in 5 sectors, the most polluting ones. So I mean, reading between lines, that means that at some point in time, we cannot finance those companies because we have to reduce emissions. So therefore, we would have to be financing those that have reduced their own emissions.
Thank you, Marta. And Marion, moving on to you, how does impact investment differ from traditional investment? And can startups ever decouple themselves from economic growth, or should they? Maybe they should still pursue it, but in a different way. How do you see this?
So yeah, maybe to define impact investing, there are 3 main pillars in this definition, and that distinguish impact investment with traditional investment. First is the intentionality. The intentionality of the business, creating positive impact instead of reducing negative impact. That's what Marta was mentioning. The second one is additionality. What do you bring to solve a social or an environmental challenge? And the last one is measurability. How do you really measure outcome, outputs, and impacts on the long term? So impact investing is investing in companies that have the 3 elements incorporated, embedded in their strategy. And then about the question of returns, financial returns, growth, and impact. I do believe as impact investors, we are looking for business models and companies able to create economic, social, and environmental value at the same time. But in the short term, I really think we need to accept less profitability because today there is a premium to vice on the financial market. You're not financially rewarded by creating positive impact. So in this context, in this financial context, I think as impact investors, we need to accept a lower profitability in the short term, even if the business model is able to create economic, social, and environmental value, and ideally with with changing the rules of the financial markets, and I think is needed to be able to incentivize financially big corporates and small companies to have this kind of business models, creating triple value. And we have to, and I really think we need to find a way to cancel this premium to vice. And if you're creating negative impacts, you shouldn't be rewarded financially. And so to give an example to make it understandable, for example, today is more valued on a financial point of view in the financial market to have a coastline of burning garments, for example, for textile leaders, or burning garments like, for example, dead stocks, it's better on the financial point of view than having a new business unit reselling second-hand or reused clothes with a lower margin. And if we keep these rules, we are not incentivizing creating business model, creating social and environmental value. We are just rewarding people not caring about the negative impacts of the business. So on the short term, I think we should accept less profitability to support these companies and enable them to grow. And on the long term, I do think there are business models and circularity business models, or circular business models are, I think, a great example. We can expect great profitability and great social and environmental value.
So we have to make some compromises at the short term, and then in the long term, this should shift towards.
And also because I think, sorry to keep talking about it, but also because I think we need to change the mindset of what's performance, what's growth, what's our goal.
What's success?
Yeah.
So Marion, going back to something you mentioned before, it's not only us here or investment that it's going to shift or towards sustainability or whole economy or whole society. We need to bring society along, employees along, and especially maybe in your case, Marta, that you have, it's a bank that it's very big and sustainability might be quite new related to how old the bank is. And Bill Gates recently said something regarding this. He said, I don't think it's realistic to say people are utterly going to change their lifestyle because of concerns about climate. The solution, according to Gates, is creating better technological alternatives with same prices or even cheaper to accomplish the same goal in climate change, in climate conscious way. So it's not about changing mentalities of society, it's about bringing them a cheaper alternative or a better solution, right? What do you think of this?
I would say that both, because we, as not only as managers in our own corporates or as consumers, but we all, even you in your company, we need more information to get and to make informed decisions. So probably we do something in cases that it's negative and has a negative impact because we don't have information. So I think that awareness, information, creating consciousness is absolutely essential. And actually out of the market research that we perform at the bank with retail consumers, asking about what is the role that we should play in this transition, they don't expect, we as banks have important decisions to make and we can make a change, but we don't have a big direct footprint. Our footprint and our commitment is through the finance that we provide, the investment that we provide, and the advisory that we provide to customers. So when asked about what we should do, they talk about this point of creating awareness. So that's one thing. And the other, obviously, we need, and I absolutely agree with you mentioned about the innovation and then things in a different way to take more out of what we want to focus on. But we need a lot of things to make this. We need more incentives. We need, as banks, we need regulatory convergence. We need more clear, more transparent information to avoid greenwashing risk. More transparent information to encourage funds to come into our business. We need more impact funds, probably. So we need, for that, focus on positive impact rather than avoiding the negative one. So many things that are incentives, not just in terms of cheaper products, but in terms of other things that could improve and accelerate this path.
Marion, I know it makes sense. You have a very huge movement to bring society along, and even inside makes sense. Like the way you manage makes sense. It's amazing in bringing everyone along and taking their having their their opinions in mind. So how do you do this of actually taking a lot of individual interests and bringing society along towards this transformation? Even companies, you have, I think, inside Makes Sense, a service of kind of creating this awareness inside other companies. Can you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah. So just to explain what Makes Sense. Makes Sense is an ecosystem that has a mission to transform the world to be inclusive and sustainable. I agree, that's a very ambitious mission. But to do so, we think we need all stakeholders to get on board, as we were all saying before. So we are working with citizens on engagement programs to enable all the citizens who want to contribute to change the world to do so. We are working with big corporates and public organizations to also take them on board to accelerate these dynamics and to transform themselves from the inside. And then we are working with impact entrepreneurs, creating new solutions, innovative, disruptive solutions, from incubation to investing in them. So now Makes Sense is 200 people, organizations. We are working all around the world. We have 6 or 7 offices around the world, and we are working so globally because we think social and environmental challenges are often global, but also very local. So we are working on adjusting all our solutions to the local context, and we think that's a change is only possible if we are talking to the citizens, to the people, and are talking about their close environments. So that's why we bring local solutions. And as we believe society needs to be inclusive and collaborative, we try to walk the talk and work like this within Make Sense organization. We are working with TEAL principle. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but basically we have a very horizontal organization, and everybody have a say in the strategy, in the way we work, in the direction we are taking. And concretely, we are when we are building our strategy for 2030, all the 200 people are working on it and taking decisions. And I know it might seem impossible, but I swear I've seen it from the outside, and now from the inside, and it's working. It's based on trust, transparency, and sharing the right information, as you said, giving everyone the same information to be able to make decisions. It's based on having the right people at the right spots in the company, to make people shine where they know how to shine and work together. It seems like, I know, a fairy tale, but and I'm not saying it's easy to work like this, but we feel that's showing the way and showing that's possible. And it's been 12 years we are building this organization based on these principles, and we are also accompanying the entrepreneurs and the social businesses we are working with and investing with to work like this. And there are many examples in the world of big corporates also working like this. So I think it's by walking the talk that we can really lead the transformation. So that's what we try to do.
I've already asked you so many questions about Make Sense, and I still have so many more. Like, I think it is a dream, but it's possible. It shows. Alessio, to you, you were saying today that it cannot only be on policy. It needs a joint effort to achieve this and to bring society along. But what I see in a lot of conversations is that people are saying things like they should ban this, or they should incentivize this, or they should tax this. Inside policy, what's your point of view to bring society along? I guess we should start with trying to convince them, but if they don't come along this transformation, start banning things, or how does this, what's the approach on this?
I think, so to your meta question, let's say, of consumers slash Bill Gates, technology and so on. I mean, I've given you a very technologically or innovation-driven message, but I don't want to downplay the importance of what people can do in changing their preferences, in part by reducing on a variety of things. If you want to fly less, eat less meat, I don't know, crank down the heating, go ahead. And the more you do that, the better and the faster it is. So I was mentioning these projections on costs in the order of magnitude of 300 and something billion every year. The more these type of changes happen, and we're talking about things at the margin. So I'm not saying like, never use a car again. It is like on short distances where it's reasonable, flat and so on, use a bike. On this type of behavior, the sum of these parts can slash investment costs by a third. So it's huge, it can happen now, whereas if we have to build a power plant that is on renewables, it takes time, it takes a lot of money and so on. So the more you manage to get consumers on board, the better. The only thing I'm saying is I wouldn't bank on the transition happening because of people giving up stuff. The more they do it, the better. The more you persuade your family, friends, and so on to do it, the better. But I wouldn't hold my breath on this dimension. And if we had to do it through changes in behavior or giving up stuff, we're not talking about changing your iPhone every 4 years instead of 2. We're talking about a shrinking in the standard of living that is huge. And so that's where I think that technology comes into play in order to try and substitute the whatever it is, good or service you were using before, with a new option that is more planet compatible. Bear in mind that people care about the service that is provided even by the good. So you care that there is light in this room. How the light comes is sort of beyond the point. At different points in our history, we've used different technologies to get light into this room, whether it was candle, whether it was whale fat, at some point, whether it was with kerosene, now with LEDs. All of these technologies have a completely different impact on the planet or on animals around us, biodiversity, but you care about the service. So that's one dimension. Related to what you were saying, my theory of change is again that I believe that there is a bracket of consumers typically more well-off and more environmentally aware that are willing, and there's surveys that show this, that are willing to pay more for something that is more planet-friendly, less CO2-intensive, or so on. And I would say the way these things have played out in the past is you target those consumers early on. Typically, your new technology or whatnot is going to be more expensive, but it's fine because there is a bracket of consumers that is willing to pay for that, because the new technology is perceived as higher quality. For whatever reason, right now higher quality means more planet-friendly, fine. At different moments in time, it meant different things. As that technology gets adopted, the more it spreads, the more it becomes easier. It becomes cheaper because there are scale economies, the more it becomes widespread, and business models improve and so on. And so I'm not waiting for the whole of society to be converted to the green cause. The more people are, the better, early stage, but then at some point you reach price parity and the green option and the cheap option coincide. And at that point is where new technologies and green technologies will spread, which is why typically technology spreads through an S-curve, which means you start very slow and at some point you go exponential and then you sort of plateau. This is like a pattern that we've seen throughout the history of the past 200 years of how technology spread from the radio to the TV to the smartphone and so on. And I think that we're going to see that for green technologies as well. Many of these things have been around for decades. I think the first Toyota Prius, which was a hybrid car, came out in 1990s. So there have been experiments with more hybrid vehicles, electric vehicles for decades now, but right now is where we are looking at the beginning of an exponential trend. these things are likely to reach price parity soon, but soon means not, short term, long term. Here we're talking 2 years, 3 years, not in 2030. And at that point, again, you have people on board. You asked me what regulation. So within this context, you can play around with regulation and you can play around with pricing of things, but with an optic of, as I was saying, not let's say, orienting private sector innovation in the service of things we care about and of the planet. But it is a matter of, let's say, orienting the system and capitalism rather than trying to do the transition through bans.
Okay. I think we're a bit over time, so I'm going to open it to the audience in case you have any questions. No? Gonzalo.
I have so many questions. Thank you very much for the debate. It was really, really good. So you have been studying, and thank you for the presentation of your book. That's really, really interesting. I'm just having the curiosity, if we achieve a net zero economy in terms of carbon footprint by 2050, what would you believe will be our objective this year? No? Once we have achieved this, what will be like the next objective that we have that we can have? And if not, what will be the objective? Like putting more years in the count? What do you believe?
I love philosophical questions, but let me get this straight. So you're saying for each year, or if we reach the target in terms of the direction to net zero, or you mean once we reach net zero, what is the next thing that we're going to care about? That is a brilliant question. I've given so many of these presentations, and I've never received this question, which I think is crucial, in the sense that, and I'm not saying this because you run the place. And I didn't know that, I guessed that. But I think that it's important because on this green transition dimension, I have the feeling that we're looking at it as if it's the end of history. And so that sort of, so it's a concept that has been applied for international relations, but applied to technology, as if our whole challenges as humanity end in the moment in which we reach net zero in terms of carbon emissions. And instead, I am confident that new challenges will emerge. In part, they will emerge because of the technologies we're using in trying to solve one of the problems. Most of the challenges we have now are solutions to past problems we had. If you look at, I don't know, the excess of nitrogen in the oceans, it is part of the solution to a problem of low yields at some point in the 1950s. If you look at CO2 emissions, it is the product of trying to get out of poverty in the 1800s. I don't know. But every time, in trying to solve a problem, you solve one and you generate another. And that's a bit how you proceed as humanity. Some find that depressing. To me, it is a sort of a trial and error process where you fix one thing and then you continue on with different challenges.
But maybe on this question, which is interesting also in terms of nature and environmental impact, many solutions focused on climate and carbon emissions reductions are against, in a way, biodiversity preservation, for example. So even if just with this challenge of protecting or solving the environmental challenge, we need to already to take decisions on what's the priority first, and also assessing the negative impact on other aspects of for example, it's very well designed in the donut because there is 9 different aspects, if I remember well. So if you find a solution solving one environmental challenge, you might hurt the other aspects. So already you need to balance and to choose.
Yeah, and also how you've reached the net zero, because you might have reached that, but not in a fair way, and living people behind. So in the component of net zero, the just transition is absolutely key. So there are a lot of components in how you bridge also that net zero, not just the day after, but how.
So one question for Alessio. So do you see that there is being in the future years more incentivization to those that are, let's say, having a positive impact and really measuring it, and at the same time to penalize a little bit those that are creating negative externalities that are not that much measured? Do you think that, not banning, but do you think that there's going to be this trend, a rising trend?
I mean, there is a growing push. I guess your question is from a government's perspective of what governments can do. There is a growing push in the direction of environmental legislation. So that it's true in Europe, it's true at European Union level, it's true at the countries of Europe level, and also beyond. Now, the shape this will take is a mix of the things you're talking about. So, for example, on CO2 emissions, there is an increasing push to say we already price those emissions, we should crank up these prices, and so you're penalizing the production of CO2. Again, this is in the service of reorienting the economy and effectively giving an incentive to new technologies that do not produce CO2 emissions. In certain instances, you use regulation. So, for example, there is an increasing use of regulation for things like banning single-use plastic. Packaging, yesterday was a proposal, I was reading about it on my plane this morning, in saying we set quantitative targets of how much you need to reduce the amount of plastic packaging and so on. So you can use, and you will see more of this in the process. Generally, I'm not a fan. What I try to say is, and that's maybe the mainstream economist that is in me that is coming out, is prices are a more flexible tool. So you're letting companies decide how they want to address this problem, and you're giving them incentive to do so. Regulation are more coerce. So you're just choosing a specific aspect and say you're not allowed to do this. And it's hard as a regulator. I'm not an expert of the repercussions that this is going to have throughout processes, production processes, and so on. So in general, I'm much more a fan of pricing rather than regulation. But for a variety of reasons, including political ones, we're not necessarily going to see pricing. In the United States, they cannot agree to a carbon pricing at the federal level. And so when they come up and develop the Inflation Reduction Act, you don't have carbon pricing in there. And what you have is a lot of money, of billions, 340 billions, in subsidies to green technologies, to the development and deployment of green technologies. The idea there is that effectively at some point you will reach price parity and the green option and the cheap option will coincide. And so you don't need carbon pricing at that point.
Thank you all. I'm sorry.